I'm Daniel Veksler, and I'm here to help you understand Russia better and without bias. This is part 2 of the history of the meetings between US presidents and Russian leaders. Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan appeared pretty chummy during their several meetings throughout the 1980s. Gorbachev was in his 50s, while Reagan was in his 70s. Gorbachev was a relatively young liberal reformer. Reagan was a weathered American conservative and a former actor. Gorbachev would preside over perestroika, the last period of Soviet history which led to the country's collapse. He is very often criticized for this in Russia, even by people who would not want to see communist rule come back, which is most people. In 1989, Gorbachev would reform the political structure of the USSR and legalize alternative political parties for the first time in Soviet history. In 1990, before the Soviet Union had ceased to exist, when Gorbachev was still a sitting president of the USSR, US President George Bush Sr. already met with Boris Yeltsin, who was then the president of only the Republic of Russia, one of the republics of the Soviet Union. Less than a year later, Yeltsin was again in the United States with an unofficial visit in June of 1991. 2 months later, the coup began that would finally lead to the collapse of the USSR and to Gorbachev's resignation. Yeltsin had a long friendship with his American supporters. He visited Bush Sr. in upstate New York immediately after the collapse of the USSR, and he laughed it up with Bill Clinton in the Rose Garden. He was such a lovable bear, so flawed, so charismatic, such an enemy to the Soviet Union from which he came, and so friendly to the US. How could we not love him? We all remember George Bush Jr.'s claim that he had seen Vladimir Putin's soul in his eyes, and it was a kind soul. He also said he trusted Putin because the Russian president wore a cross on his neck. Something a great number of Russians do, by the way. Their relations seem to have been much friendlier than Putin's relationship with Barack Obama, and maybe that's partially because both Bush and Putin come from backgrounds that are traditionally racist. However, Bush and Putin were definitely political opponents. Bush backed the regime of Mikhail Saakashvili in Georgia, which had an armed conflict with Russia in 2008. By the way, today, Saakashvili is a fugitive in his native Georgia, but was given Ukrainian citizenship a few months ago and was immediately named governor of Odessa, a historically and culturally Russian city that the pro-Russian separatists in southeastern Ukraine had taken, but lost back to Ukrainian forces after a drastic and violent battle. Despite Putin taking Bush Jr. for joyrides in his vintage Soviet car, when Bush would speak about needing more democracy in Russia, Putin said, "I hope you don't mean the kind of democracy that you have established in Iraq." When Barack Obama became president, Vladimir Putin was temporarily not the president, but the prime minister of Russia. At the end of Bush Jr.'s tenure in office, Russian-American relations had soured over Georgia, and at first, Obama said he wanted to reset relations. To that end, he went to Russia in 2009. There was some trauma over an apparent snub of President Obama by Russian officials, when they shook Russian President Dmitry Medvedev's hand, but not Obama's. Prime Minister Vladimir Putin had President Obama over for a casual breakfast, at which he lectured him for 45 minutes on Russian history. Later, when Medvedev came to the States, Obama took him and a press corps to a fast food joint. During that meeting, he said to Medvedev, "Watch out you don't get ketchup on your tie." In 2012, Putin became president of Russia for the third time, and Obama won his second-term election. Ever since then, relations between the two leaders have been very tense and unproductive. Last week, the two men met for the first time in 2 years, when both were in New York City for the UN General Assembly. Again, not much progress was made. Keep watching Understand Russia for an expanded point of view.
And if you want to learn even more about Russia, this time in person, Modern Wall Street proudly promotes our very own Daniel Veksler, who will be teaching a spring 2016 course at NYU from February 22nd to May 9, 2016. Click on the link below and also in the comments section to be redirected to the NYU Spring 2016 course enrollment page.